In spite of considerable evidence to the contrary, few of us are taught that all life forms on Earth are highly intelligent. Nearly all children in the West are still taught by both school and culture that intelligence is a primary attribute of the human species, and that all other life forms on Earth are less intelligent, usually in some sort of descending pyramidal hierarchy with people at the apex, and so on down. Thus, it would be humans, dolphins, chimpanzees, dogs, and so forth. Though birds and lizards to insects, then plants and microbes, and then, I guess, maybe air molecules or something. They're pretty stupid, right? This is a rather grim holdover from 19th and early 20th century thinking, and it is terribly incorrect. The foundational problem with that view is that all living organisms, it turns out, are self-organized, and all of them show emergent behaviors. As Michael Crichton once commented, it did not take long before the scientists began to notice that complex systems showed certain common behaviors. They started to think of these behaviors as characteristic of all complex systems. They realized that these behaviors could not be explained by analyzing the components of the systems. The time-honored scientific approach of reductionism, taking the watch apart to see how it worked, didn't get you anywhere with complex systems, because the interesting behavior seemed to arise from the spontaneous interaction of the components. Unfortunately for reductionists, one of the interesting behaviors that arise in complex systems once biological self-organization occurs is, always, intelligence. Nothing has undermined the older, more mechanical view of the world than spontaneous self-organization and the resultant nonlinearity of living systems, and their implications. As mathematician Stephen Strogatz puts it, in every case, these feats of synchrony occur spontaneously, almost as if nature has an eerie yearning for order. And that raises a profound mystery. Scientists have long been baffled by the existence of spontaneous order in the universe. The laws of thermodynamics seem to dictate the opposite, that nature should inexorably degenerate towards this state of greater disorder, greater entropy. Yet all around us, we see magnificent structures that have somehow managed to assemble themselves. This enigma bedevils all of science today. Eerie? Strogatz's word choice is deeply revealing. Eerie means strange and frightening, and its synonyms are uncanny, sinister, ghostly, unnatural, unearthly, nice one, supernatural, and so on. The majority of reductive scientists, when they experience this fundamental aspect of reality, experience one overriding emotion: fear. Self-organization leads to an inescapable conclusion. There is more going on than mechanical reductionism perceives or can explain. Bedevil is an interesting word as well. To torment mercilessly, plague, worry, annoy, frustrate, be possessed by devils, bewitch, and finally to spoil or ruin. It ruined our good time, and our lives are now plagued by merciless earth devils. Such self-organization always begins the same way, or, as researcher Scott Kamazin put it, at a critical density, a pattern arises within the system. Thus, When a container is packed with increasing numbers of molecules, at a certain point, which can never be predicted, the random motions of the billions and billions of molecules will suddenly show an alteration in behavior. All of them will spontaneously synchronize. The molecules begin to move and vibrate together. They begin acting in concert, acting cooperatively, and becoming tightly coupled together into one. Interacting whole, exhibiting a collective, macroscopically ordered state of being. They become a unique living system, of which the smaller subunits, the molecules, are now only a part. At such a moment, the molecules have combined into a system that is self-organized. A phase change occurs. Something more than the sum of the parts has come into being, and it just happens. Like water turning into ice. And you can't quite predict what the system will look like after the phase change. For instance, at 1 degree above freezing, water is still liquid, but simply decrease 1 degree in temperature will cause a sudden shift in the water state, a phase transition. A very tiny change, as small as 1/100th of a degree, once the temperature is approaching freezing, will cause the water to change its physical form. Suddenly. Synchronization occurs abruptly, and unless it is something you have already experienced, it is impossible to know that it's going to happen. One moment there is one state, the next, something entirely new comes into being. This is why the potential for a phase change on Earth is so dangerous. Such a shift will not be a simple alteration in what we have always known. It will be like water to ice, something completely different, so different, in fact, that none of the current cultural and scientific assumptions or pictures will be of any use to our survival. And that new thing, neither its physical nor its behavioral nature can be predicted from a study of its parts, from an analysis of the prior state. As Kamazine and company comment, complexity in complex systems generally refer to a system of interacting units that displays global properties not present at the lower level. These systems may show diverse responses that are often sensitively dependent on both the initial state of the system and nonlinear interactions among its components. Since these nonlinear interactions involve amplification or cooperatively complex behaviors may emerge. There is no linear additive process that, if all the parts are taken together, can be understood to create the total system that occurs at the moment of self-organization. It is not a quantity that comes into being. It is not predictable in its shape or subsequent behavior or its subsequent qualities. There is a non-linear quality that comes into being at the moment of synchronicity. There is also not just a shift in the form in that moment of self-organization, but also the emergence of new behaviors. That is, the system begins to act. As physicist Paul Davies comments, nonlinear systems possess the remarkable ability to leap spontaneously from relatively featureless states to those involving complex cooperative behavior. And those behaviors, they can be as different as water to ice. It can be something like, like pathogenic bacteria all over the earth suddenly becoming completely resistant to antibiotics, all at the same time. Or earth temperature suddenly jumping 20 degrees Fahrenheit and staying there forever. The system begins to display something other than synchronicity. It begins to act as a unit, to have behaviors. And just as a study of the parts of a self-organized whole cannot give an idea of the larger whole's nature, so too the study of the smaller parts' behavior cannot give an idea of the larger system's behavior. As Kamazine et al. Note, an emergent property cannot be understood simply by examining in isolation the properties of a system's components. Emergence refers to a process by which a system of interacting subunits acquires qualitatively new properties that cannot be understood as a simple addition of their individual contributions. Or, as systems researcher Yanir Bar Yam puts it, a complex system is formed out of many components whose behavior is emergent. That is, the behavior of the system cannot be simply inferred from the behavior of its components. Emergent properties cannot be studied by physically taking a system apart and looking at its parts. Or, as Goethe put it over 2 centuries ago, life as a whole expresses itself as a force that is not to be contained within any one part. The things we call the parts in every living being are so inseparable from the whole that they may be understood only in and with the whole. The whole, tightly coupled system, at the moment of self-organization, begins to act upon its microscopic parts to stimulate further, often much more complex synchronizations. A continuous system of information begins flowing back and forth extremely rapidly between the macroscopic ordered whole to the smaller microscopic subunits and back again, interocepted, so that the self-organizing structure is stabilized, its newly acquired dynamic equilibrium actively maintained. This information stream also immediately includes the external environment, where a similar rapid flow of information occurs, exteroceptive, in order to more fully enhance stability. In other words, the system becomes deeply engaged in processing interoceptive and exteroceptive data, analyzing it, and altering its self-organized state based on that analysis. The system is now displaying what is called emergent behaviors. At some point, the increasing number of molecules that self-organized crossed a threshold, beyond which occurred that moment of self-organization. On one side, there was nothing but randomized molecular movements. On the other, there was sudden self-organization and emergent behavior. All self-organized systems remain very close to this threshold, just barely on the self-organized side of it. It is this dynamic balance point, near the edge of chaos, that makes the system so responsive to the interoceptive and exteroceptive inputs. That leads to an incredible capacity for innovation in self-organized systems. Michael Crichton described it impeccably. Even more important is the way complex systems seem to strike a balance between the need for order and the imperative for change. Complex systems tend to locate themselves at a place we call the edge of chaos. We imagine the edge of chaos as a place where there is enough innovation to keep a living system vibrant and enough stability to keep it from collapsing into anarchy. It is a zone of conflict and upheaval where the old and new are constantly at war. Finding the balance point must be a delicate matter. If a living system drifts too close, it risks falling over into incoherence and dissolution. But if the system moves too far away from the edge, it becomes rigid, frozen, totalitarian. Both conditions lead to extinction. Only at the edge of chaos can complex systems flourish. This threshold line, that edge between anarchy and frozen rigidity, is not like a fence line. It is a fractal line. It possesses nonlinearity. It is, in fact, much like a coastline. And like a coastline, its exact orientation in space and time ebbs and flows. At the moment the threshold is crossed, at the moment when self-organization occurs, the new living system enters a state of dynamic equilibrium. From that point on, the self-organized system retains an elegant sensitivity to that threshold point. It exists just on the balanced side of that threshold, and so constantly monitors any incoming energy flows that touch it, for each incoming energy flow causes the system to move slightly too close to the line again, a process that can cause it to lose organization entirely if allowed to go too far. As that occurs, the system analyzes the nature of the flow it has encountered and crafts a response to it, which will restore the balance point. A very simple example of this is juggling. If you have ever learned to do simple juggling, or even seen someone do it, there is a point when all the balls are up in the air where an almost magical balance point suddenly comes into being. This happens with unicyclists and their riders too. Before juggling, you have balls here, juggler there, a dynamic system separated into its parts, not, at the moment, in dynamic equilibrium. When the juggler picks up the balls and throws them into the air for a moment, they are all still isolated parts. But then there is that magic moment when the juggler finds the balance point. At that instant, he and the balls become one unified whole, existing in a state of dynamic equilibrium. They have crossed a threshold of self-organization. Juggling occurs. But once it does, immediately the juggler begins to slightly move his hands and feet this way and that way to maintain the balance point. This is emergent behavior. Tiny perturbations, exceptionally tiny disturbances of the balance point, a slight movement of a ball this way or that, indicate to the juggler just how that perturbation can affect the dynamic equilibrium. So he moves his body, his feet, his hands to keep the balance point intact. But there is no way for any juggler to think those perturbations through with the linear mind. It takes too long. By the time he does, the balls will have fallen. The conscious mind is too gross a tool, too slow, too focused on parts rather than wholes. So at a very deep, unconscious level, some part of the juggler takes in that perturbation, extracts the meaning within it, and then alters his movements to maintain the balance point. Those perturbations are communications, but they have to be analyzed extremely quickly, and a response initiated just as fast in order not to drop the balls. It must be done by feel, intuitively, that is, by some other part of the self than the part that thinks linearly. Once the balance point is found, the sensory gating channels open more widely in order to respond to minute alterations in that balance point. The body, sensory channels, and conscious mind achieve a synesthesia, a unity of perceptual analysis and response. The more accomplished the juggler, the more open the sensory gating channels become in response to the task set, and the more complete the synesthesia. The entire process takes place in a state very similar to dreaming. It's done by feel, below the level of conscious awareness. In response to the intent to juggle, the conscious mind steps back and allows the rest of the self to take over, for only in that way can juggling occur, the balance point kept. As soon as the linear mind becomes dominant, the balls will fall, the balance point is lost. This says a lot about the ultimate success of the West, using the linear mind to solve problems. Juggling is a simple example of a complex, nonlinear system existing in a state of dynamic equilibrium close to the threshold of self-organization. It captures the kind of behavior of whole systems that chaos theory or nonlinearity attempts to explain. There is an inherent indeterminacy in these kinds of systems. There is no way to predict what perturbations will occur at any moment in time, nor is there a way to predict living systems' responses to them. You can start off with two identical as possible jugglers at the same spot on a performance floor, and you will never be able to predict where they will end up in the room or the movements they will use to juggle the balls. The best you can say is they will most likely be in the same room, and if they are good, they will probably manage to keep the balance point intact. Every living system, phenomenon, organism is like this. Every one of them exists close to that threshold, and every one works at much greater degrees of complexity than a juggler manipulating his balls. Editor, shouldn't you change that sentence? Writer, no, I don't think so. What's wrong with it? To maintain the balance point that came into being at the moment of self-organization, this is done through a tight coupling to both the internal and external worlds. In self-organized systems, the information from the smaller subunit, in this example, the juggler's balls. Editor, wait a minute. Writer, what? Travels to the larger whole as chemical cues or electromagnetic fluxes or pressure waves and so on. The larger system, the juggler, takes in the information, analyzes it, and alters his behavior. In other words, the system alters its name to incorporate the changes into receptive inputs so that it can keep its self-organizational nature intact. The information generates a response to it by the system. Information from the external world, exteroceptive inputs, is taken in similarly. For the juggler, floor perturbations which alter how his feet are balanced, the flow of the air in the room, comments from the audience, and so on, will all affect his stance, orientation, and balance, which affect his capacity to keep his balls in the air. So that exterior to the system information is taken in and, again, below the level of conscious awareness. Behavior is altered to keep self-organization, the homeodynamic balance, intact. And this type of process works very well in living systems. As James Lovelock notes, no one doubts that humans are in thermostasis, yet our core temperatures range from 35 to 40 degrees Celsius, and our extremities from 5 to 45 degrees Celsius. This may appear imprecise, but it serves us well. Informational pulses travel back and forth from the system to both its parts and the exterior world, extremely rapidly, and last as long as the system itself remains self-organized. Based on the information gathered, the system then alters its functioning from millisecond to millisecond. In living systems, unlike jugglers and balls, the amount of analyzed information is considerably larger, many millions of times larger. In order to maintain the self-organized state, the living entity that comes into being in that moment, the thing that is more than the sum of the parts of necessity, must immediately develop mechanisms for analyzing two things: inflows from the exterior world toward me that now exist, exteroceptive inputs, and the functional states of the parts that have self-organized to make up the whole, interoceptive inputs. Failure to analyze the inflows can result in death, the loss of self-organization. As well, dysfunction of any of the parts can also lead to loss of self-organization. This is why every part matters to the whole. Remove the lungs, liver, and pancreas, and whether or not you have a brain becomes irrelevant. Remove the plants, forests, waters, and whether or not you have scientists or opposable thumbs becomes irrelevant. Inflows from the exterior world, not from me toward me, have of necessity to be understood. Their nature, but more importantly their intent, has to be determined. And once that occurs, a response to the inflow has to be crafted. By all useful definitions of the term, this is intelligent behavior. It is also the way dictionaries such as Merriam-Webster's define it. The ability to learn or understand or to deal with new or trying situations, or the ability to apply knowledge to manipulate one's environment. Interestingly, the word intelligence comes from the Latin phrase interlegere. It means simply to choose. And in fact, a crucial addition. It is a prejudice of evolutionists who give adaptive explanations of the features of organisms that every difference between species must be a consequence of different selective forces that operated on them. Populations subject to identical selective conditions may arrive at quite different evolutionary endpoints, so that the observation that two species differ is not prima facie evidence that they were ever adaptively differentiated. Thus, if you take two plants, same genus and species, and plant them in identical environments, just as it is true with jugglers, they will end up at slightly or sometimes very different places. Their leaf patterns, chemical structure, and dynamic interactive interface with their surrounding environment will not be the same. Faced with the same environmental pressures, each will choose slightly or very different responses from a larger number of possible choices to those environmental pressures. And what they choose, and in consequence what happens afterward, can't be predicted. As Lewington goes on to say, the characteristics of a living object is that it reacts to external stimuli rather than being passively propelled by them. An organism's life consists of constant mid-course corrections. Mid-course corrections. That is the capacity of a living organism, and that includes everything from viruses to human beings, to choose among multiple effective options in response to incoming environmental pressures. It is in fact indicative not only of the capacity to choose, but also, most distressingly for reductionists, of free will. In other words, every living organism on this planet, including such self-organized systems as the white blood cells in our bodies, has the capacity to analyze the nature of outside forces that touch them, determine their intent, and then to exercise judgment in determining from among a number of potential responses which one to implement. That this is true and has been known to be true for a very long time does not stop the extreme discomfort engendered by saying it out loud. Most people, including the majority of scientists, have been taught that human beings are somehow innately different from the other organisms on this planet. Nevertheless, we are not. We are different only in the specific ecological functions we serve, just as every living organism is. But we are not different in our underlying capacities from the other life forms on this planet. And most definitely this includes intelligence. Our intelligence is only a special instance of a general condition. When researchers in the late 19th and much of the 20th century began examining the world for intelligent life forms, they regrettably but understandably used themselves as a template for finding it. Perhaps that is why they have had such trouble finding it, just saying. They began judging all life forms by human norms. In other words, they looked for language that seemed like our own, tool-making that seemed like ours, social organization that seemed like ours. They rather insistently projected a human-centric orientation onto the exterior world. Any organism that had some of the human attributes they deemed indicative of human intelligence was accorded more value than those organisms that appeared to have less. Or, from another frame of reference, they were using as a measuring stick the concept of the evolutionary pyramid, or the escalator. Specifically, we emerged from the primordial ooze, and slowly we turned, step by step, and in the world red in tooth and claw, we crawled up out of the clinging slime. By dint of our superior intelligence, we rose to the top of the evolutionary pyramid, the supreme life form on this planet. Finally, from heaving sea of blind, striving life forms, each struggling for continued existence, awareness emerged. The earth, nay, even the universe itself, did thus become conscious of itself, and we stood on the pinnacle of our greatness, alone, looking out at the great void of the universe, wondering, is there anybody else out there? Or as Robert Heinlein once put it,
Man is a rationalizing animal, not a rational one. And as it happened, scientists looking out at the void did notice some sophisticated human-like attributes in some other life forms. Dolphins, in fact, seemed pretty smart, and chimpanzees too. Then dogs, maybe. Parrots? Not sure about janitors, though. Still, those early researchers, standing on the pinnacle of their greatness, were, in their own fashion, finding that intelligence in one form or another was an attribute of the living organisms they were studying. Whether it was the discovery that prairie dogs have a complex language, that in fact they describe the movement of other animals through their territory in great detail, including, if those animals are humans, distinctions in the color of their clothing, or finding that chimpanzees can sign up to 350 words and even invent their own words for objects they haven't been taught words for, and then teach the ability to use sign language to their offspring, or that their memory is better than ours, or pop quiz, how many words of chimpanzee can most intelligent primatologists speak? Hint, a lot less than 350. Let's see what number starts with a Z. The discovery that dogs can add and subtract, or that ravens make tools, or that dung beetles navigate by the stars, or that amoeba farm bacteria for food, or that crocodiles and alligators design and use tools to more easily capture water birds, or that elephants can learn to speak human language, or that dolphins use nonlinear mathematics in seeking and finding their food. Examination of the living organisms around us continually reaffirms that intelligence is an attribute of living systems, even when using humans as the yardstick for measurement. Nevertheless, despite this, there remains, among most researchers and nearly all non-researchers, the belief that humans are the only organisms with real intelligence. Dolphins may be as smart as us from that frame of reference, probably not, but chimpanzees are more properly thought of as much lower on the scale of evolution. In another million years they might think as well as us, maybe, but other animals, they're much further back, much lower on the scale. Just because prairie dogs have made up specific prairie dog words for fat guy with red shirt doesn't mean they are intelligent. And besides, animals, even birds, are like us, sort of. They are very close behind us on the evolutionary escalator, compared with things like bacteria, and so have developed some rudimentary capacity to think, just not very well. If they were as advanced as us on the escalator, they would think just like we do. But they are behind us, back there on a lower step. A reminder of where we came from not so very long ago. Bless their hearts. Or as Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan once put it, our intolerant slogans continually denigrate the non-human life with which we share this planet. But while the evolutionary escalator is an incredibly common expression of a belief in human exceptionalism, it doesn't have any real basis in ecological reality. The view is one Darwin specifically rejected, which makes it all the more ironic that it is neo-Darwinists who've spread it about so much. Darwin's own perspective, as the English philosopher Mary Midgley comments, is much different. He did not see evolution as an escalator, but as a sinuous branching radiating pattern. Not a staircase, but perhaps a bush or seaweed. Life forms diverge from each other to meet particular needs for their various environments. Our own species figures, then, only as one among the many, with no special status or guarantee of supremacy. This notion has, however, always been found far less exciting than the escalator model, which has been enormously popular ever since it was promoted by Herbert Spencer, in spite of Darwin's own rejection of it and its evident complete irrelevance to his theory. The cerebral hypertrophy the cerebral hypertrophy that so many reductionists celebrate as evidence of human superiority, that they insist puts us on the top of the evolutionary ladder is in fact only a projection coming from their particular psychological orientation. In fact, as Midgley comments, the old picture of man's rise to dominance showed brain evolution dramatically as a series of successive conquests, in which at each level of life a new brain area and its faculties came in to rule the rest, culminating in man and final victory of the cerebral cortex, or some specially splendid part of it. Detailed neurological work has, however, worn away almost every aspect of this seductive picture. As Stephen Walker, a neurological psychologist, says, one still has a sense of regret that this charming and convincing tale must be discarded. The weight of evidence is now, if anything, more in favor of the unhelpful suggestion that all the fundamental parts of the vertebrate brain were present very early on and can be observed in lampreys. Our brain is not especially unique, nor does it confer on us any special faculty not already present in the system from which it emerged. Nevertheless, brain chauvinism has continually led to ridiculous utopian projections like this one by molecular biologist William Day. Man will splinter into types of humans with differing mental faculties that will lead to diversification and separate speciation. From among these types, a new species, Omega Man, will emerge, either alone, in union with others, or with mechanical amplifications to transcend new dimensions of time and space beyond our comprehension. Or as the science fiction writer Greg Bear once put it, we are now in charge of our own evolution. As Midgley comments, world pictures like this one are not primarily science. The science that is supposed to justify them is really a small part of their content. They are actually metaphysical sketches, ambitious maps of how all reality is supposed to work, guiding visions, systems of direction for the rest of our own ideas. Everything in that frame is judged in terms of the human, as if we are outside the ecological matrix in which we are embedded, as if evolution ended once and for all with our emergence, with the development of our brains. And this kind of thinking has invaded nearly every aspect of human life. Some water. As Rupert Sheldrake put it, the evangelists of science and technology have succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of the missionaries of Christianity. The trouble is that this world view is not accurate to the world itself or to the findings of researchers in scores of fields. Unfortunately, nearly everyone in the West believes significant aspects of it to be true. Our thinking has been corrupted by bad software and inaccurate description of reality. In consequence, our experiences of ourselves, the world, many of our behaviors have been corrupted as well. The wildly disseminated picture of our human exceptionalism is grounded in the assertion that we possess a unique form of intelligence due to our unique hypertrophic brain. But this belief is not true. It has become a kind of intellectual imperialism. It has been, and still is, used to denigrate the orientation that many people still experience, that the world and the other organisms with which we share this earth are alive, intelligent, and aware. It has been used to stifle the response of the heart to what has been presented to the senses. This has resulted in the creation of a conceptual monoculture that can't see outside its limitations. Such imperialists have set out to conquer the superstitious natives inhabiting the dark continent, the place where the general populace lives. Midgley makes a point that arguments such as Day's rest in a belief in human beings as an isolated will, guided by an intelligence, arbitrarily connected to a rather unsatisfactory array of feelings, and lodged by chance in an equally unsatisfactory human body. Or, as Susan Sontag once described it, consciousness harnessed to flesh. As if there could be consciousness without the emergence of the self-organized system we call the body. This type of dissociation is a common side effect of the materialist and very reductionist view of the world most of us are trained in. But Midgley notes, this system of thought is not reason, not science, but behavioral examples of, as she puts it, an unexamined, exuberant power fantasy. It is bad software, generated out of an unexamined psychological framework. The evolutionary escalator metaphor and the assumptions of what constitutes intelligence and value that are embedded within it create, automatically, behavior that is very dangerous to other every other life form on this planet. In fact, to the health of every ecosystem this planet possesses. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. The belief in our unique intelligence is, and always has been, a lie. And while this power fantasy is slowly eroding in the light of unavoidable animal intelligence, as Giorgio Samarini notes, studies on animal behavior are providing ever more data in direct contradiction to behaviorism's rejection of animal mentality. And more scholars and researchers are distancing themselves from the behavioristic paradigm and beginning to admit that possibility of perceptive consciousness in animals. It is certainly not eroding when it comes to simple, non-brain processing forms of life, such as viruses. Nevertheless, intelligence emerges as an aspect of self-organization in living systems, always. What is actually true is that once self-organization occurs, the capacity for analysis, innovation, and response all occur contemporaneously. And the degree of intelligence in living organisms, irrespective of whether they have a brain or not, or are an animal or not, is exceptional. This finding is beginning to pervade nearly every field of science, laying waste to the older paradigm. But most scientists are still very reluctant to accept what is becoming obvious. As Paul Davies comments, to date, biology is rooted in the old physics, the physics of the 19th century. Newtonian mechanics and the thermodynamics play the central role. More recent developments, such as field theory and quantum mechanics, are largely ignored, in spite of the fact that the molecular basis for life is so crucial, and that molecular processes are quantum mechanical. Atoms are treated like classical building blocks to be fitted together. Distinctively quantum effects, such as non-local correlations, coherence, and phase information, let alone possible exotic departures from quantum mechanics as suggested above, are not considered relevant. Again, the degree of intelligence in living organisms, irrespective of whether they have a brain or not, or are an animal or not, is exceptional. And examples abound. For instance, the capacity to engage in mathematical computation and differentiation is common. As Richard Lewontin observed, in Cloudocera, a small freshwater arthropods, reproduction remains asexual as long as conditions of temperature, oxygen dissolved in the water, food availability, and degree of crowding remain constant. Then if a sudden change in these conditions occurs, the Cloudocera switch to sexual reproduction. The organisms are detecting a rate of change of an input, not its absolute value. They are